Welcome to the Atlantico podcast, where we talk about the science behind the Atlantico project, the Atlantic Ocean, and the human adventures experienced along the way. Here, we have conversations with guests from around the world who work together so that we can better understand, manage, and protect the ocean. So let's embark on the journey of Atlantico and discover the world that lies above and beneath the surface of the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. Before you listen to today's episode, just a quick word to say that when I recorded this episode with Thulani, the connection, so the network wasn't the greatest. As a result, the audio is sometimes a little bit jumpy, but nevertheless, I really hope that you get to enjoy this conversation with Thulani. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we have another episode to discuss a region of the Atlantic with one of the Atlantico scientists who embarked on the Tara schooner during the Mission Microbiomes of the Tara Ocean Foundation and one of Atlantico's flagship expeditions. Our guest today, Thulani Makhalanyane, was chief scientist on Tara for a little over a month as the team sailed from Namibia to Congo. So let's discover what the crew and the science team have been studying during that leg of the mission. But first, let's get to know our guest. Thulani, hi and welcome to the podcast. I really cannot wait to hear about your experience on board.
Hi, Louise. Thanks for the invitation. I've heard a few of the previous episodes, and I think this podcast is exceptionally well done. I'm really excited to share.
Thank you, Thulani. That's really kind of you. So as I mentioned, and as we do with each episode, I'd like for us all to get to know you a little bit better. So maybe you can tell us about yourself, where and how your connection with the ocean started, and then share the journey that has led you to where you are now and doing what you do.
Oh, what a very complex question. But as you know, I am a South African. And despite us having more than 3,000 kilometers of coastline, I don't think I saw the ocean up until I was about 5 or 6 years old. At that point, I remember taking a trip. It was on a train with my grandmother to Durban, which is, South Africa's most famous beaches for some reason. So in our country, the ocean is seen as a way to cleanse the body of evil spirits. So there is a very deep connection, one might say like a spiritual connection with the ocean. I can still recall when we went to the beach that we had to bring back, bottles of water for relatives every time we went back to the sea. And I can say to this very day, there's no better feeling than being close to the ocean. So about my journey. So I've always been very curious about science. And although I could not maybe clearly articulate this, I was always surrounded by people growing up that were in 5 different professions. Back then, you could either be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, a government administrator, or a social worker. So I knew that none of these appealed to me, and I could not see myself doing any of these jobs. So when I had to apply for university, I put down a Bachelor of Science as my major, knowing absolutely nothing about what a Bachelor of Science entailed. But what I did know that it seemed to combine my love of biology and maths, so I went through it. I did not really know what I wanted to do after that, or whether I wanted to do a PhD, until probably about the 3rd year of my program. We had a small group activity, as one usually does, but it was so nice because it combined more or less the scientific method, and it was my introduction really to the scientific approach, and I felt compelled, to study further. And also, I really liked the process of identifying problems and then addressing those problems. So luckily, my parents supported my passion and I could continue my studies. As of, in South Africa, we've got a 3-year degree and an additional year, which is called your honors year. I studied aquatic microbiomes, but this mainly focused on contamination in groundwater systems. So after this, I moved to Cape Town, where I joined a group that was focused on Antarctic microbiomes. I was absolutely captivated with microbes at that point, and especially extreme microbiomes. And this is what I did for my PhD. So maybe to fast forward like a few years later, I had an opportunity to start a research group at the University of Pretoria. So a colleague, of course, advised me that I should establish my group in an area that I'm passionate about. And I instantly knew that whatever I was going to work on had to include marine microbiomes. So fast forward again to 2015, I was given an opportunity by the Department of Science and Innovation in South Africa to join a series of meetings that were aimed at developing a science plan for the South Atlantic. So these meetings involved several partner countries in South America and also in the southern parts of Africa, where we were tasked with developing what a science plan for the South Atlantic would look like. I'm very glad that I attended this meeting because, the science plan would go on to form components or be signed as the Bellum Agreement. This agreement was core, of course, to the solicitation for the Horizon 2020 core. So, yeah, that's a long, rounded way of...
very interesting. We've heard about the Bellum Agreement in a recent episode with Sigi Gruber. So we know how instrumental that was in leading to projects such as Atlantico. So somehow we have to thank you for it as well.
More Sigi and others that corralled us as scientists and got us to actually get things done.
So our conversation today, we want to focus on the leg which you have led. You were the chief scientist on board of Tara, from Walvis Bay in Namibia through to Luanda in Angola and to Pointe Noire in Congo, all along the western coast of Africa. So maybe to start with, could you explain what you and the team were studying in that part of the ocean and why there? What was so special about that region?
Sure. So maybe I should start by saying, I've spent a lot of time in Walvis Bay, also doing my PhD research. So it was actually very nice being back at that part of the world again. So in a way, there is some continuation, I think, about, in terms of what I did during my PhD, where I focused on the Namib Desert and Namib Desert soils. So in part, my PhD investigated microbiomes in desert soils, and this included knowing a little bit about the diversity of these organisms and what ecosystem services they provide. So what we also know is that there is a huge influx of desert soil into the oceans. So this leads to one of the most biologically productive regions on Earth. So in an ocean or in an environment where nutrients are usually depleted, the influx of these nutrients creates an environment where there's no longer this limitation. And so productivity is not limited at all. So as part of the work that we tasked with in Atlantico, we are really interested in exploring the dynamic between nutrient availability and the effects on microbiomes. So specifically, what we wanted to know was how nutrient co-limitation in different regions of the South Atlantic impacts on microbiomes, and in turn, what those impacts might do in terms of driving productivity within this environment. So what we set up to do as part of this cruise was to set up a series of experiments where we measured trace element availability in the oceans, concomitantly take up samples that would allow us to come back to the lab and test the microbiomes. So everything from bacteria, archaea, viruses, and microeukaryotes that are present within that environment. So this is something that's essentially not really known in this part of the ocean. And we were aiming to provide more or less the first sort of insights regarding the effect of nutrient co-limitation.
Yeah, so when we talk about things like co-limitation of nutrients and trace elements, what are we actually talking about, and why does it matter for the microbiome?
The environment and microbes that are in the environment do not function in isolation. Microbes directly depend on some of their nutrients from the environment in which they are found to carry out their metabolic processes, right? To either produce food for themselves, to put it simply. So regions like the South Atlantic and also the Southern Ocean are known to have limitations in the availability of certain nutrients. So for instance, iron is present at very minute amounts in the Southern Ocean. And iron is an important cofactor because it allows the microorganisms that are present in that environment to carry out certain metabolic processes. So if that iron is not available or is available in small amounts, it may limit the extent to which...
How was this all studied? So what did you have to do when you were on board? What will happen next? And also, how will this help us to increase our knowledge about the ocean, how it is doing and how it might evolve over time?
Another complex question. So what we did is that we set up a series of stations where we deployed the protocols, which I'm sure you would have heard about in previous podcasts. So we collected a range of different samples from these geographic localities. And how we actually set up our field sampling survey is that we defined areas based on previous studies where we were moving from places where the concentrations of trace elements are known to be high to those where the concentrations are known to be low. So in that way, we set up a sort of gradient, and this gradient could be used as a space for time substitution to more or less understand in a region where nutrients are limited in terms of their availability, how do they impact on the microbiota that are present within that environment? And we could do that in high nutrient concentration areas. So by setting up a series of stations, we could get to a point where we combine the data to more or less look at how changes in the availability of certain nutrients impact on the marine microbiota. And what we also did as part of our field survey, and maybe we can talk about this a bit later, is that we set up on board a 72-hour experiment. This 72-hour experiment allowed us to sample at different times of the day, in the morning, at noon, and also at midnight. The reason for this is that, depending on when you acquire samples and how much light is available, the type of microbiota that you find in any environment are likely to change, right? So an example that's typically used is that if you have a liter of soil and you suck out a mil of each, the type of microbes that could be in that large portion, although they might be consistent, you would find certain taxa that dominate across in each of those mil suctions that you took out, right? So there's complete and known variability in the oceans. So part of sampling at different times of day was to more or less try and understand how the microbiota change in a diurnal cycle and how that change impacts on the productivity of those microorganisms. So those are the two principal experiments we did.
Wow. So yeah, that is going to tell us a lot about the ocean, and as you say, to kind of mimic the evolution of the environment and to understand how changes in the environment and availability of nutrients and trace elements might impact the life in the ocean. As we've heard in previous episodes, each of the scientific studies of the expedition was dedicated to a woman who contributed to the field of marine sciences. And in this case, it was dedicated to Dr. Naledi Pandor. So can you tell us a little bit more about her and her contribution to the field of marine sciences?
Yeah, thanks, Eloise. So, in the previous podcast, Leg 13 was, as you know, named after Leslie Shackleton. And this leg, as you just said, was dedicated to our former Minister of Science and Technology. She's currently the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Naledi Pandor. So Dr. Pandor is really a great role model and recently earned her PhD at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Pandor was born in Durban, a coastal city and one of our biggest coastal cities, to a family of anti-apartheid activists. So she comes from a family that was very deeply rooted in the struggle for freedom for South Africa. So Dr. Pandor has made, in my view, many substantial contributions to the development of South Africa and African national systems of innovation. There are several people who we owe the signing of the Belém Agreement to. And in South Africa, I believe we owe Dr. Pandor a great deal of thanks because she was quite intimately involved in the processes that led to the signing of the Belém Statement, and also in terms of fostering the development of polar and Atlantic marine research. I'm sure you and your listeners will know that South Africa has a long history of racial exclusion, and the participation of Black South Africans across various fields is usually very low. In the past, some marine activities, for instance, marine sports, have been reserved exclusively for people who identify as either white or European. And there were various laws that systematically excluded Black people. So, for example, although South Africa has a long history of polar research, the representation of Black scientists and those from historically disadvantaged institutions is still, below 10% of the total number of academics. So we do not have in South Africa enough Black scientists and researchers working in marine research. So I have personally been in meetings where I am often the only Black person. And in this situation, I don't think it's a tenable situation if we want to increase our considered efforts into understanding marine environments, not just polar marine environments, but just science more broadly. So Minister Pandor, to get back to her, has been at the forefront of efforts to increase the representation and also help our citizens, people in South Africa, recognize the importance of oceans and the fact that the oceans really belong to all of us and that they're not really reserved for a small minority. So she has been key in advocating for better monitoring, the sustainable use of marine resources, and other key intentions that are well embedded now in the Belém Statement. So I would say for her contributions in developing marine research in South Africa, I cannot think of a better person than
great lady indeed, with tremendous contributions to marine sciences and to promoting marine sciences in South Africa. So Thulani, to finish with, if we go back to your experience on board of Tara, could you share with us what it was like for you, about your life on board, the memories you've brought back from that region of the Atlantic, and of course the people that you shared the journey with?
That was, Eloise, really like an incredible and special adventure. And I'm pretty sure, next to being in Antarctica, this is right up there in terms of moments I'll treasure forever. So as a microbial ecologist, I'm really lucky because I get to, see all of these interesting places and essentially travel the world. But the key thing as I, embark on these travels is that I get to interact with others. During the cruise, we had a chance to have some stopovers, first in Angola and then the second one being in Pointe Noire. So it's always very interesting to travel around the continent because it gives you a better sense of the country and also the people. So I thought both Angola and Congo had a lot of enthusiasm, and I could pick this up, when we had the outreach activities in terms of the questions the young people especially asked me. But something very small that I picked up and stuck with me in our leg or our stopover in Angola was seeing people that looked like me doing water activities in Club Nautica in Luanda. That was really striking for me, to see people that looked like me sailing, canoeing, and swimming. This is not something that you'll ever see when you're in South Africa. If you do, it will be quite rare. We're heading to a point where things are starting to change. But obviously, because of the cost, as most people that are Black will not have the financial means to participate in these types of activities. So that's something that stuck with me. And it gave me sort of a hopeful sense of what the future could look like. Yeah, so there's really I don't know where to stop, because in my conversations with people on board, we had a range of different conversations during the downtime. A lot of them were not really rooted in talking about the science, but we touched on things involving politics and the state of the world and what needs to change. So those types of conversations are always invigorating, because they give you a better perspective of what your contribution is as a scientist towards effecting some of this change that we all want to see. So there's too many special moments and too many conversations to recall specifically, but
kind of that really isolation from your routine or your day-to-day world on land. It gives you a bit of time and the mental space to have those sort of conversations, and that, you live in a bubble for a while. So actually our episode has come to an end. I would have loved to continue our conversation. But I have to thank you, Thulani, for your time, your availability, for explaining everything that has happened during your leg, and also sharing your experience with us. And we'll make in the show notes, we'll put the links to the videos and outputs that were created during that leg. And if there's a link to the profile of Dr. Pandor, then we'll put the link for that as well. And thank you again, Thulani. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Louise, for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this.
We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode and look forward to seeing you next time. You can follow the Atlantico project on our website on www.atlantico.eu, and you can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. All the links and information on the project and on today's episode is in the show notes. Atlantico is a project funded under Horizon 2020, a European Union research and innovation program.